morning, everyone. Does anybody have a question before we start? Any questions? Listen, the multiple choice, the best way to study for that is to know something, just something really basic about that term. I'm not asking you to have an encyclopedia quality definition for it, or anything to that end. You just need some familiarity with the term itself and how and why it fits into the context of our class. If you can do that, you're going to be just fine. Right? So, a suggestion, I'm a real visual person, I don't know about all of you, but what I typically do is I make up note cards, and I limit myself to 5 words that will jog my memory as far as that term. So, Constitution, for instance, the supreme law of the land, stronger central government, whatever it is that makes sense to you, that's what you need to know. Because if you understand that about the Constitution, right, you'll know everything that you need to know when it comes to how it fits into the context of our course. Okay? Does that help? The reason that you're not seeing a longer multiple choice, section, well, not section, but time period, is really twofold. One, if I gave it unlimited time, people will go online, look it up, or have their notes sitting right there to help them answer the questions. And obviously, that's not really an exam at that point. 2, the more you think about a question like multiple choice, the more likely you are to talk yourself out of the right answer. So, anyway. Good question. Anybody else have a question? All right, I really don't have anything in the way of announcements, but one thing I would like to bring to your attention. If you do need to leave class early, I'm happy to accommodate you, but please try to let me know ahead of time, because when you walk out of here early, it assumes 2 things. It assumes that I don't see you walking out. I promise you I see you. And secondly, it assumes that once you sign the sign-in sheet, I don't care that you leave my class. Once again, I promise you that I very much care about that, so please, if you know that you're going to need to leave early, come see me, and I'll be happy to make arrangements for you. Please don't walk out early ahead of time. Any other questions before we get into the meat of today's lecture? All right, guys, what we're going to do right now is pick it up where we left off the last time. And last time we were talking, we had just fought an American Revolution. We had our independence, and therefore, our next task at hand was setting up a government that was able to implement a lot of these ideals that we held so dear in the Revolutionary period. Now, one of the ways that I've always liked to think about this period, aftermath of the Revolution, is sort of like teenagers when they're talking to their mom and dad, when I grow up, I'm never going to do to my kids what you've done to me. That's essentially where we were as a nation. We said we're never going to treat our citizens the way that the British had treated us. Then we grew up, we got our independence. Did we find out that there was a method to the British madness? Absolutely, right? So answer me this question. Did we discover that there was such a thing as too much freedom? Too much freedom, too much democracy, too much discretionary ability concentrated in the hands of too many people. Did we figure that out? How did we figure it out?
Shays Rebellion.
All right, Shays Rebellion is a good example. Anything else? Articles of Confederation that we'll talk about here in a moment. But think about this, right? Is it a problem that everybody has a vote? Every single person living in the country has the right to determine the outcome of elections. Is that a problem? Did we find out that it was a problem the last time? Yeah, why is it a problem? When government makes decisions, does it make a decision based on economic bottom lines sometimes? Of course it does. And therefore, one of the things that we saw as problematic, people like John Adams said, in order to vote on some of these issues, when it comes to property taxes, things of that sort, maybe it's a good idea that the people that are doing the voting actually have some sort of vested interest in the outcome of the election. Because it's real easy to vote for a tax increase when your taxes aren't going to go up, right? Now, another example that we had referred to the last time, a bicameral versus unicameral house. Now, first of all, the house, as we saw it, that would be the legislature, where laws are made, okay? Now, we talked about a unicameral house. What was a unicameral house? Who remembers? Right, one house. Was it advantageous to have only one house? It wasn't? It was. In some ways, talk to me about those ways.
Because the bill is in check, it's just automatically passed, so there may be some issues to be about.
Okay, listen. You've got a real simple process here. Somebody brings an idea to the vote, right? In other words, everybody must wear pink pants on Friday, right? It either passes or it doesn't pass. A 51% majority will rule the day. The advantage is things are quick, things get done. The disadvantage. What could be the disadvantage? You kind of said it, but I want somebody to say it much more directly.
There's a lot of bad laws.
Or at least potential for bad laws to become actual laws, right? I mean, sometimes what's really, really popular and our initial knee-jerk reaction to something isn't always the wisest decision that we could make, right? So yeah, you're going to get faster laws, but you're also going to increase the likelihood that those laws could become bad laws because there's not going to be a lot of debates, right? So the bicameral approach, first of all, how many houses? 2, right? Unicameral 1, bicameral 2, 2 houses. So before a law can become a law, it's actually got to go through not 1, but 2 houses. Is this advantageous?
Certainly.
Yeah? Like how?
Laws are made and passed at the speed of news.
Okay, right. But a simpler way of saying that is what I've always called the idiot check, remember? Like the pink pants law, if somehow, some way it managed to get out of the House of Representatives, the Senate still has an opportunity to knock it down, right? So it's a nice filtering aspect to legislating processes, right? Before a law can become a law, it's got to go through 2 houses, not just 1. So that's the nice part about having a bicameral house. You've got to debate it, you've got to discuss it, and generally those 2 things are healthy for any democracy. Debate, discussion, good things. The problem, the downside. Francisco, can you put what you said in maybe simpler terms?
The way that the idiot check is put in, that either people are going to be constantly arguing about certain laws, so they pass out slower.
Exactly, that's key. That's what needs to be in your notes. The bicameral house is great when it comes to discussion. The problem is it takes a long time to discuss. It takes a long time to convince. And yeah, you're going to get legislation at a glacier's pace. And if you don't believe me, turn on the news right now. It's almost impossible for, Democrats and Republicans to agree on anything, let alone to the point where, exactly, the government shuts down. Okay? So we can see that there really isn't one rubber stamp right way to set this up. There are advantages and disadvantages to just about everything. There's side effects to everything. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? Now, the bicameral approach was the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the problems that this country faced in the 1780s after we had won our independence. Now, I mentioned this the last time. Typically in democracies, what you'll see is a central governing document that spells out who's in charge of what, who has the power to do this, that, or whatever, what rights individuals have within the society. And in 1777, what did we decide on? What central governing document? Good. The Articles of Confederation. And what kind of federal, central, Washington government did the Articles set up for us?
A weak central government is strong.
Good. A weak central government. Very good. We wanted a weak central government in 1777. Any ideas as to why? We had just fought a war against a strong central government, and we didn't want the same thing to happen after our independence, right? We wanted more power being brought to people at the lowest levels of the political society, right? So, who did the Articles of Confederation give more power to? State and local governments, right? And the thought was pretty simple. Who knows Texas better than Texans, right? Why would you want some people in a faraway government planning out your life for you when you're perfectly capable of doing it for yourself? So the people that passed the Articles of Confederation, you can see where they're coming from. given not only the American Revolutionary War, but also the simple fact of the matter was, this will bring government closer to the people. Did it work? Was it successful? What was the problem? Or maybe better yet, problems. What were the problems? Exactly. One of the problems of the Articles of Confederation, and if it's not in your notes, it needs to be, it does not give the central government the power to tax the people, at least on a state-by-state level. The only people that could tax you would be your state, which sounds great, except for we had massive amounts of debt. And it's not like Massachusetts was going to go, oh, please, let us assume $1 billion worth of this debt. That wasn't going to happen, right? So the fact that the Articles of Confederation did not allow the federal government to tax the people directly was a really big problem in the sense that we're getting ready to default on these loans. We almost went broke before we were even a country. So that's a problem. What other problems present themselves under the Articles? Right. States would get into it over one issue or another. I used the example of a border dispute the last time. And these problems would go on and on and on forever because nobody had the final say. Right? I mean, you don't have a federal government that can resolve disputes, arguments between states. Okay? What else? There's at least one more issue that we should talk about. What about our economic policy? How do we encourage American consumers to buy American-made goods? Tariffs, right? Taxes, duties. The problem is, the Articles of Confederation didn't say that the federal government could make one big economic policy, right? In other words, Georgia had its own policies, and Massachusetts had its, New York had its, and generally speaking, you had 13 different economic policies. So something that was taxed in Pennsylvania very well may not be taxed in South Carolina. And you can imagine that the headaches and the frustrations that this is going to produce when it comes to governing a complex economy like ours was. Okay? So here's what I like to think about the Articles of Confederation. On paper, they're a wonderful, beautiful idea. This is a way to bring power of the government closest to the people and make government up of the people. The problem is, you've got such a weak federal government, and you've got so many complex problems, that it's almost too much power, and it's inefficient when it comes to governing a complex, diverse society like ours. Okay? That's primarily where we left off the last time. What I want to talk about this time, to begin anyway, is the rise of a nationalist faction, right? Now, for your notes, a nationalist faction, a group of policymakers that could clearly see that the Articles of Confederation were a problem. People like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Adams, they could see that on paper, yeah, the Articles of Confederation sounded really good. But the problem is, political societies don't play themselves out on paper, they play themselves out in reality. And in reality, there were problems presented by the Articles that were just not being handled. They were not even being addressed. So this nationalist faction, for your notes, it wanted to create a stronger federal national government out of necessity, right? The only way that we were going to be able to address the problem that was the national debt was allowing the government to tax the people directly. And the only way we had to do that was giving the federal government the authority to tax people. Right? So this nationalist faction, this is the group of American policymakers that can understand we need to replace the Articles of Confederation with some other governing document, because if we don't, we're in big, big trouble. Okay? Now, in 1784, this nationalist faction meets behind closed doors. I'm serious. In Philadelphia, which was home to the Philadelphia Convention, where all these people are going to discuss the need to create a stronger federal government, right? They literally shut and locked the doors and shut the shutters and locked those too. And this is in the middle of summer, so it's hot and sticky. They did not want the general American public to know what they were talking about behind those closed doors. Now, what they were talking about was creating a federal government that could preserve the ideals of the American Revolution, and to some extent, the Articles of Confederation, and secondly, address the problems where the Articles were just not getting it done, right? Now, one of the key figures of this convention was a guy from Virginia named James Madison, right? Now, let me tell you a little bit about Madison. At least in this particular moment, what he envisions is a government that's almost identical to a monarchy. In other words, under his plan, the president would have almost the same kinds of powers as a monarch, as a king, right? Now, in particular, what he came up with came to be known as the Virginia Plan. And under the Virginia Plan, not only do you get a federal government that's up 10 times stronger, right? The ability to tax, the ability to regulate external commerce. It's also got the ability to overturn state laws at the discretion of the federal government. So let me slow down and give you an example. This is a very personal question, but I want you to think about it. How much money did you pay to the state, to Austin government last year in the form of an income tax? How much money did you pay? How much money? I know it's impolite to ask you tax questions, right? How much money? 8.2. 8.2? No. No. You're thinking of another tax. You did pay it to the state government, not that tax. That's a sales tax. We all paid 0, because there is no such thing as a state income tax in Texas, right? Same thing with Tennessee. There are certain states that do not tax incomes, but you need to understand, not everybody looks at this the same way that Texas does. For instance, where I'm from, not only do you pay a state income tax, before I left Michigan, I also paid a city income tax. So I was getting hit 3 ways: federal, state, and local income taxes, right? So under this provision of the Virginia Plan, what the federal government could say is, Texas, we really don't care about how you see this whole issue of a state income tax. Under this provision, the federal government could force us to adopt a state income tax. It could knock down other state laws that are really important to us, that are designed by and for Texans. How does this sit with you? Do you like the idea of the Virginia Plan?
No.
Why not? Say it louder, please. Yeah, it's giving an unimaginable amount of power to the federal government. It's giving the same problems, or could give rise to the same problems, that we saw in the 1760s. Taxation, other forms of legislation with no representation, right? Now, this is not going to be sold to the American people. I mean, there are a lot of people that went to the convention and said, look, I understand we need a stronger federal government, but the fact of the matter is, there's no way I can sell the Virginia Plan to my constituency. Nobody's going to go for something like this. So ultimately, what comes out of the Philadelphia Convention is not the Virginia Plan, it's actually the New Jersey Plan. Now, the New Jersey Plan does strengthen the power and the authority of the federal government. It corrects and it reverses a lot of those problems that the Articles of Confederation had given rise to. It does strengthen the power of the government, but it also preserves the individuality and some of the authority of the states, right? What I like to think of it as, it's a kinder, gentler version than Madison's Virginia Plan. Now, the other thing I want you to understand about the New Jersey Plan, this is going to be a blueprint, a very rough draft of what would ultimately become the Constitution, supreme law of the land, and I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But do you have any questions before I move any further? Anything I can address for you?
So the Virginia Plan strengthens the central government to almost monarch status.
Exactly. And so, therefore, it's very unpopular coming out of the Philadelphia Convention. Exactly, where they met to discuss the need to strengthen the government. Can somebody pull those doors shut, please? Now, we've got the idea, at least on paper, to strengthen the federal government, but before we can implement this, we need to understand the inner workings, the guts, so to speak, of a stronger federal government. And the first thing I want you to be mindful of is this whole issue of representation. Now, back in the 1760s, that's the only thing you heard out of our mouth. No taxation without representation. Basically in our sleep, right? But anyway, we found that this whole concept of representation was far more complicated than we had initially envisioned. Okay? Now, in the end, we ended up going with a bicameral House. So if you look at Congress today, it's got a House of Representatives and it's also got a Senate. It's a bicameral legislature. Okay? Now, how many representatives does Texas get when it comes to the House of Representatives? It's based on population. Very good. So the more people you have, the more representatives in Congress you get. We're a big state. So we get a lot of representatives. New York, California, Illinois, they're big states too, so they have a lot of House members in Congress. A little state, like Wyoming or Idaho, do they get a lot of people? Because nobody lives there, right? So the thought was real simple. Laws that come out of Washington are going to affect Texas, going to affect New York, much more than they're going to affect Idaho, simply because the population is much, much greater, okay? But if you're a little state like Wyoming or Idaho, what might you be concerned of?
Power.
Yeah, power. And that the bigger states are going to run this show because they've got a lot more representatives than the smaller states. So you're really concerned about the power that's being given to this lower house, at least in the lower house, because the big states have an advantage, because they've got more people. They're going to have more representatives. How could you offset this imbalance of power? In the Senate, sorry? Very good. In Texas, how many senators do we have? And in Wyoming, and in Vermont, and every state in the country gets 2 senators. Doesn't matter how big, and it doesn't matter how small, the most you get is 2. Okay? So a law comes out of the House of Representatives. That's very, very harmful, shall we say. It's very controversial to the smaller states. What can the smaller states do to protect themselves, given our bicameral approach? What can they do? Right? They can knock it down in the Senate. What you're going to need in the Senate is equal cooperation with big states and small states. What do you think about this? It was called the Great Compromise. The big states compromised with the little states because ultimately what we wanted was cohesion, and we wanted the Constitution to be ratified so it can become the supreme law of the land. Yeah?
The Great Compromise is basically a cohesion of the big states and the smaller states?
Yeah, here's a simpler way of saying it. The big states are saying, look, we will essentially give up the great power we have when it comes to numbers, because ultimately we're more concerned about ratifying the Constitution than we are about protecting the advantages that we have when it comes to our population.
So basically cooperation?
Yeah, and I'm asking you, do you think that that's a good idea? Do you think it's a good idea? Mm-hmm. You think it's a good idea? Yeah? Why? You think it's a work? Have you turned on the news
It's
lately?
it's not working.
Well, I mean, if it's not working now, what makes you think it'll work 50 years from now or 50 years from now? Let me preface this by saying, I'm not somebody that thinks that we should just pass laws willy-nilly. I think they should be debated, and I think it should be relatively difficult to make a law stick, right? Because it needs to work for everybody, not just one segment, even if it is 51% of the population. But the simple fact of the matter is, it's a lot like how we elect presidents, right? Right? I mean, if you get elected president of the United States, sometimes you can win that office without winning 51% of the popular vote. Has it happened? It's happened in your lifetime, right? George W. Bush in 2000 lost the popular vote and still won in the Electoral College. So the simple fact of the matter is, what New York and what Pennsylvania and what Massachusetts gave up in the 1780s was essentially a simple majority. If it's 51% popular, it passes. So not only are things going to be quicker, right, but ultimately laws that come out that could be beneficial to the bulk majority of the population can be held up by a minority. And in some instances, a very small minority at that. And if you are interested in more of that, again, there's this thing that comes on at 6 o'clock called the news. Turn it on and inform yourself, right?
Okay, so the Great Compromise is the big states cooperating with the little
Yeah, the big states are giving up this ability to simply say, you know, laws affect us at a bigger proportion than they do Connecticut, for instance, or South Carolina is another good example that I'll talk about in a minute, right? You can protect or knock down laws that could be very beneficial to the bulk majority of the population, okay? So, the burning issue that people like South Carolina are concerned about in the 1780s, when we're going down this road of a stronger federal government, what might states like South Carolina be worried about?
The population of their slaves concerning the representation.
Yeah, or more, just simply, slavery generally speaking. New York, big population. Pennsylvania, big population. Massachusetts, big population. And what those states have in common, in some form or fashion, abolitionism, the idea that slavery should be outlawed, is beginning to gain traction in all of them. So what South Carolina lives in fear of day and night is that there's going to be a law that's coming out of the House that could maybe go to the Senate for a vote that would outlaw the lifeblood of the South Carolinian economy, slavery, right? So if you're South Carolina, and you're the only state in the country at the time where the slave population actually outnumbers the white population, what do you need to do to ensure your peculiar institution survives? What do you need to do? Well, you got fear. That's one thing that you do have. I'm saying, what do you do to even out the balance of power? What do you want more of in the House?
Representation.
Exactly. You need more representatives. The problem is, you don't have enough white guys to go around. So what do you need to do? What is it? There's white people that live there, and you also have a lot of? Exactly, slaves. They said, we want to start counting our slaves. And to be fair, it wasn't just in South Carolina, but South Carolina, this is where the voices are the loudest. We want to count our slave population. And so states like Pennsylvania, which just so happened to be the only free state in the country at the time that the Constitution was being ratified, right? They said, are you going to give them the right to vote? They said, no. Are you going to give them the right to sit on juries? No. Own property? No. It defeats the entire purpose of slavery. And so Massachusetts and Pennsylvania asked South Carolina, why should we give you the ability to count your slaves? And South Carolina basically said, if you don't, we may not vote for ratification of the Constitution. So do you see how you have a minority that's essentially holding the whole progress of democracy hostage? Might a law that came out of the House of Representatives be advantageous when it comes to knocking down the institution of slavery? I'm talking about for white people. Obviously, that goes without saying for black people. But for working class whites, as we got done reading in Frederick Douglass, slavery benefits the exceptionally tiny minority in American life. It doesn't work for everybody. In fact, it almost works for nobody, right? A law that says you had to pay the worker something, right, anything, would have worked for the betterment of the American economy, considering it would have created more demand. That's not happening because South Carolina's got a bargaining chip. And that bargaining chip is, we won't ratify your Constitution unless. So ultimately what we did is we compromised once again. You got the 3/5 clause. There's no way that Pennsylvania was ever going to go ahead and say, you know what, South Carolina, count every slave within your state borders. They just were not going to go down that road. What they did was meet them a little more than halfway. In my opinion, a lot more than halfway, right? They said, we'll count each slave as 3/5 of a person. Politically speaking, I know this sounds really terrible, and it is, right? But at any rate, they said 3/5 of a person. So what that's going to do is it's going to allow South Carolina to send more people to the House of Representatives where they can protect, or at least better protect, the institution of slavery. And at the same time, it's going to allow New York and Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, to retain their numeric advantage in the House. Okay? So we compromised our way out. Was it a good thing? Obviously not for the institution of slavery, but why not? Who said no, first of all, King? Why not?
Well, I don't think it was a good idea because people are just basically going to plant this out that, look, even the North has agreed that slavery should be legal through political wise.
Well, it's essentially going to kick that can down the road when it comes to the issue of slavery. And ultimately, you can see this coming to a head even before the Constitution is ratified, right? Where's slavery legal? Where's it illegal? The last time we met, we were talking about the Northwest Ordinance. Congress officially saying you can't do slavery in Ohio, in Michigan, right? So, yeah, that's the problem, and it's going to preserve this problem for basically the next 80 years, okay? Any questions? Anything I can clarify to that end? Now, what we've been talking about for the last several minutes is the Constitution. One of the things that I want you to have in your notes next to the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. The supreme law of the land. The shorthand way of understanding this, the Constitution set up and afforded a much stronger, more powerful federal government. A government that would have the ability to do things like tax the people directly, right? A government that would be able to do things like raise and maintain military defenses. A government that would be able to do things like regulate external commerce. So instead of having 13 different trade policies, we'd have one, and it would be enforced through the central government in Washington, okay? Now, I also need you to understand, before this can become the supreme law of the land, the states have to ratify it. In other words, you need a majority of states, 9 in particular, to go ahead and say, we can live by these plain rules. We will go ahead and vote for the Constitution to be the supreme law of the land. Once you've got 9, it becomes the law. It will replace the Articles of Confederation. Now, during this period, if you were a supporter of the Constitution, you were a Federalist. Federalist, rather. If you were suspicious of the Constitution, you were an Anti-Federalist. In other words, too much centralized power is a bad thing. And we saw why in the American Revolutionary War. Now, there's 2 states that I want you to be mindful of when it comes to Anti-Federalists. 1, Virginia. 2, New York. What do those 2 states have in common? Are their populations big or small? They're big, right? Are their economies big and diverse or small and unilateral? Big and diverse, right? So my point with this, New York needs the central government a lot less than the central government needs New York, right? Actually, I think I said that backwards. New York needs the central government a lot less than the central government needs New York, right? If you're South Carolina, if you're Vermont, New Hampshire, then of course you've got a lot more at stake. You want a stronger federal government that can protect you as a relatively small state. But if you happen to be New York or Virginia, you've got a strong economy. Why would you give up your ability to regulate your own economy? Right? You've got a big population. And right now, the Articles of Confederation favor the big states because they're allowing the New York to do their own thing without a lot of outside interference from the federal government. Now, I want you to understand something about New York and Virginia. These are your holdout states. These are the states that are saying, you know what, I'm not so sure about this whole Constitution thing, considering we've already got a good thing going. In order to convince people, in New York in particular, to warm up to the Constitution and a stronger central government, we see the issuing of the Federalist Papers, okay? And that's what I want you to be mindful of as you watch this brief video clip. The Federalist Papers. Who wrote them? What did they do? And how did they convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution?
Everything now depends on the incalculable fluctuation of human passions. We'll know in several months whether it is yes or no.
In order for the Constitution to become the law of the land, 9 out of 13 states had to ratify it. In 1787, this was hardly a foregone conclusion.
The Anti-Federalists were frightened about this new government usurping, taking away power from the states, who were quite understandably, because the Constitution explicitly forbade the states from exercising a number of powers. You could no longer levy tariffs. The state